I had a normal life up to a certain point. What is friendship to you? For me, friendship is when I can rely on a person and be sure that they will not let me down. It's when I'm in trouble, and a friend will always come to my rescue. That's what friendship is, in my understanding. But friendship ends the moment a friend starts looking at your wife. My name is Scene, and I am a mechanic. My life revolves around cars, especially one in particular, a vintage Mustang that my father gifted me on my 18th birthday. It's not just any car. It's a part of me, a reminder of home, of who I am. We've been together for 3 years, and in that time, we've never had a serious argument. In our free time, we enjoy walking in the park, watching movies, and occasionally meeting up with friends, with whom we might go to a club or sit in a bar. But there's one but. Our sex life. I know that Helen wants more than I can give her. My job is physically exhausting, and by the evening, I'm often too tired, which frequently upsets her. I try not to pay attention to the disappointment in her eyes, but it's hard. On the other hand, I understand that if I stop working, we'll have nothing to eat. My friends are a special group. Carlos, a couple of years younger than me, is in college. He's a real gym buff and loves the gym. He always likes to be the center of attention. Then there's Amber, Helen's best friend from high school, and her boyfriend, Fred. Fred and I aren't as close as we could be, but our girlfriends keep us together, and overall he doesn't bother me. Everything started with a call from Carlos. He suggested we get away for the weekend to a lake, to a resort where we could swim and relax away from the city bustle. The idea seemed tempting, but I decided to consult with Helen first. Helen came home in the evening, and I wanted to tell her this news, but she found out about this plan before me, which made me wary. Carlos had never called her directly before. Why did he do it this time? Helen was thrilled with the idea and insisted we go. She said it would be a great opportunity to relax together, especially since Fred could drive us in his big old SUV, which could fit 5 people and a bunch of stuff. In the following days, I couldn't stop thinking about the upcoming trip. Helen had already started planning what we would take with us, and her excitement was infectious. We sat in the kitchen, surrounded by maps and guidebooks she had found at the library where she worked. "This is going to be great, Scene," she said, genuinely smiling. I couldn't disagree with her. Her optimism had always been my support. That evening, as we were having dinner, I noticed Helen was increasingly distracted by her phone. "Carlos sent a list of things we need to take," she explained. I nodded, trying to hide my irritation. It's not that I didn't trust Carlos, but his sudden interest in my wife seemed odd to me. Why didn't he write to me? The following day, Helen and I set out for shopping. We needed to buy everything necessary for the trip, mainly bathing suits and food and drinks. Helen was in her element, selecting the best and most comfortable items, but what especially amazed me was her new swimsuit, which was very revealing. I barely managed to restrain myself from getting too close to her right in the changing room. "We're only going to be there for a couple of days, Helen." "Not a month," I joked, watching her carefully pick out items. She just smiled sweetly in response and continued her search. On the way home, we discussed the trip plan. Fred agreed to take us in his SUV, which was a big plus. "Everything will be perfect, Scene." "You'll see," Helen said, holding my hand. I hoped she was right. The day before the trip, we packed all our stuff and loaded it into the car. Carlos and Fred came to us quite early to avoid the morning traffic jams. Amber, in turn, was already waiting for us in the car, eager to start our little adventure. While we were driving, Helen was constantly chatting with Amber and the guys, and I felt a bit left out. Not that I minded. I was just absorbed in my thoughts. It seemed to me that I'd forgotten something important, left something significant unsaid. But looking at Helen, happy and carefree, made those thoughts recede. When we arrived at the destination, I was struck by the beauty of the surrounding nature. The recreation base turned out to be a real secluded paradise. The cabin we got was on the shore of a lake, and the balcony offered a magnificent view of the mountains. "How do you like it?" Helen asked, hugging me by the waist. "It's wonderful," I replied, and at that moment I truly thought so. We spent the rest of the day at the lake, swimming and enjoying the sun. In the evening, sitting by the fire, I looked at Helen and thought about how much this person means to me. All my doubts and fears seemed so distant and unimportant, but the night brought restlessness with it. Helen was tossing and turning in bed, and I pretended to be asleep, watching her. When she got up and left the room, I thought she was just going to the bathroom. So I just lay there, waiting. It felt like about 30 minutes had passed, and Helen returned to bed. "What happened, dear?" I asked. "Oh, Scene, you're not asleep. I just went to the bathroom. Probably shouldn't have eaten that cheese," she said, and that reassured me. And eventually we fell asleep in each other's arms. Waking up early in the morning, the first thing I felt was the cold, fresh air seeping through the slightly open window. I turned to Helen. She was sleeping peacefully, and tranquility was evident on her face. I decided not to wake her and went out to the balcony. The view from there was truly mesmerizing. Mountains wrapped in morning mist gently rose above the calm surface of the lake. I breathed in the cool air, trying to shake off the remnants of the night's anxiety. The day promised to be eventful. When everyone woke up, we gathered in the kitchen for breakfast. Helen was full of energy and suggested spending the day at the lake. Her enthusiasm quickly spread to the rest of us, and we happily agreed. Amber and Fred were already ready for new adventures, and Carlos seemed eager to finally get on the water. Carlos, as usual, was shirtless, showing off his toned arms and abs to everyone. After breakfast, we headed to the lake. I noticed Helen and Carlos whispering together, but decided not to make anything of it. Maybe they were just discussing the details of our day on the water. I didn't want to spoil the mood for myself or anyone else over trifles. The lake was incredibly beautiful. The water was so clear that you could see every stone at the bottom. We rented a boat and set out to swim. We wanted to reach the very center of the lake and jump into the water from the sides. The sun was shining brightly, and a light breeze brought coolness. Helen was laughing and joking, and I couldn't take my eyes off her. In those moments, I forgot about everything in the world. The sun reflected off her smooth and tender body. I thought if I didn't have sunglasses, I would be blinded. We jumped into the water, swam, and enjoyed every minute. Helen was happy, and seeing her like that was all I needed. At some point, I thought that all my doubts and worries had been in vain. Returning home in the evening, we decided to have a barbecue. Carlos took on the role of head chef, while Fred and I handled the preparation. Amber and Helen decorated the tables and prepared the snacks. Everything was going perfectly, and I felt like I was part of something bigger, something important. But when night fell and everyone began to retreat to their own rooms, my unease returned. Helen was acting oddly again, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was going on between her and Carlos. I went to bed, but due to my severe fatigue and sunburn, my eyes quickly closed, and I fell asleep. I don't remember if Helen was asleep at that moment, but I hoped she hadn't gone anywhere. The next morning came too soon. My eyes opened even before the first rays of the sun pierced through the curtains. The night was restless, and I frequently woke up, listening to the silence occasionally broken only by the sound of the lake. Helen seemed calm, but her unusual behavior from the previous night still troubled me. After breakfast, which was in a light and relaxed atmosphere, I noticed Helen frequently exchanging glances with Carlos. I wanted to think I was exaggerating, but those small moments made me doubt. We decided to go for a walk in the forest surrounding our retreat. The forest was dense and cool, filled with the sounds of nature. Amber and Fred walked ahead, chatting cheerily, while Helen and I followed with Carlos. It seemed to me there was some invisible attraction between them that I couldn't ignore. On the way back to the house, Helen took my hand and smiled, as if trying to assure me that everything was fine. I responded with a smile, trying to dispel my anxious thoughts. In the evenings, we arranged an outdoor movie screening. Fred found an old projector, and we settled on the grass with popcorn and blankets. Everything seemed perfect, but I still felt a tension in the air. After the movie, when everyone started heading off to sleep, Helen said she would go for a walk. "I need some fresh air," she explained. I offered to go with her, but she insisted on being alone. Her words sounded convincing, but I couldn't shake off a feeling of anxiety. Lying in bed and listening to the house absorb the night silence, I couldn't fall asleep. Thoughts of Helen, her strange nocturnal wanderings, and the exchanged glances with Carlos kept me awake. I decided I had to figure this out as soon as she returned. When Helen came back an hour later, she tried to be quiet, but I was already sitting up in bed, waiting. "Is everything all right?" I asked, trying to hide the concern in my voice. She nodded. "All's well. I was just sitting by the lake. Today was such a busy day, my head spinning." Her words didn't sound convincing to me, but I invited her to bed, and out of decency, attempted to be intimate with her. "Scene, let's not right now. It's late, and I'm not feeling well," she said, and that upset me. I turned away from her and lay down to sleep. 20 minutes later, I felt Helen trying to wake me up. Scene, are you asleep?" she said, but I decided not to respond, and she repeated the same thing about 10 minutes later, but I also didn't give her an answer. Then she got up and went out the door, and I heard footsteps down the staircase. The house was 2-storied. On the second floor there were 2 rooms, one for us with Helen, the other for Amber and Fred, while Carlos slept downstairs on a soft fold-out couch. After lying in bed for about 15 minutes, I decided to leave my room and check where Helen had been disappearing to for so long. Carefully opening the door, I found myself in the corridor, and on my haunches, I started crawling towards the staircase to listen to what was happening downstairs. Through the silence, I heard Helen's faint moans, as if something was covering her mouth. Then I started carefully descending the stairs and got a full view. As I descended the stairs, wanting to remain unnoticed, I took my phone with me, having dimmed its brightness to the minimum beforehand. I extended the phone downwards, wanting to take a quick photo, and pressing the button, I realized I had forgotten to turn off the flash, which exposed my presence. The room was dark, but moonlight streaming through the window illuminated their silhouettes. They turned around towards me, like guilty children caught stealing cookies. The world around ceased to exist. I went down even further. All I saw were Helen and Carlos. Helen sitting on Carlos, covered only by a thin blanket. I couldn't utter a word, my breathing quickened, and I felt anger filling every cell of my body. Carlos tried to say something, throwing Helen off him and moving towards me, raising his hands in a gesture of peace, but that only fueled my rage. I didn't listen to him. When he came too close to me, I reflexively struck him in the face, causing him to fall to the ground. Helen started to cry, whispering my name. But her tears, like drops of acid, only intensified my pain. I took a step back, trying to gather my thoughts. Everything inside me screamed in pain and betrayal. My wife, my love, was with another. My friend. I felt the world I had built around us crumbling before my eyes. "How could you?" I said. "I didn't mean to, I'm sorry. It's just that we haven't had sex in so long, and Carlos was so manly and handsome," she said. "Do you realize what you are telling your husband? He's handsome. Are you aware that he only got that physique thanks to pills?" I said. "I'm sorry, she said, trying to stand up and come towards me. "Don't come any closer to me. I see you didn't even use protection, right?" I asked. "I'm guilty. Forgive me," she said. "And you probably weren't aware that Carlos has a venereal disease, right?" I asked. And Carlos indeed had a disease, known only to me. He shared this with me a year and a half ago, and I kept this information secret, but if I had known he would want my wife, of course, I would have warned Helen about it in advance. "Wait," Are you joking? She began, with fear in her eyes. No, dear, you're in deep trouble. Now answer me one question. How long ago was your first time? Be honest, I asked. The very first day we got here, she said. Phew, at least that's something good, I said. Helen was sobbing, and I didn't even notice that Amber and Fred had come down due to the noise and were witnessing the whole scene. Sit on the bed, do you understand? I told Helen and threw the wedding ring at her so it hit her on the forehead, and she screamed, Ow. I started heading for the exit. I needed to get outside. I stepped outside, took a deep breath of the night air. The sky was strewn with stars, but their light seemed cold and lifeless to me. That night, I lost everything I loved. A void pulsed in my chest, leaving behind only a shadow of who I used to be. I heard noise from the house and saw that Carlos had woken up, stood up, and started yelling at Fred. At that moment, I saw Fred hit Carlos again, and he fell to the floor. I smirked. Seeing this, I began to laugh hysterically. Fred came out to me and suggested we sit at the kitchen table to discuss everything, and I followed him. We sat down at the kitchen table, and I told them everything I had learned and thought. They listened to me attentively, without interrupting, allowing me to vent everything that had built up inside. At that moment, Helen was sitting on the couch, crying. She tried to say something, but each time I told her, Be quiet. What are you going to do? Fred asked when I finished. I shook my head. All my plans, dreams of the future with Helen had shattered in an instant. I don't know, was all I could manage to say. Amber took my hands. We're with you, Scene. Whatever you decide to do, we'll support you. No one could have imagined this happening. Her words were like balm to my wounds. At that moment, I realized that despite all the pain, I was not alone. I knew we couldn't delay and had to teach them a lesson at least. Amber and Fred went upstairs to pack their things while I looked after Carlos, who was alive, and that made me happy. Helen watched from the couch as Fred and Amber brought down bags of belongings. Are you leaving? She asked. Yes, but there's only room for 3 in the car. You and Carlos will have to make your own way, I suggested. It took us 5 hours by car to get here. How do you expect us to get back to the city? Are you joking? She said indignantly. It wasn't hard for you to sneak down the stairs every night, so what's the problem getting to the city with your macho? I asked. Does this mean it's over between us? She asked. No, I just arranged all this for fun, I said sarcastically. Honey, stop. We'll make up. It was a misunderstanding. You yourself said that making mistakes is useful, she said. Firstly, I'm not your honey anymore. And secondly, I don't want to talk to you, I said. And at that moment, Fred brought down the last bag, and we went outside, locking the door behind us, leaving Helen and Carlos alone, locked in the house surrounded by the forest. We loaded the stuff into the SUV and got in the car. Amber asked if it wasn't too cruel to leave them there alone. I replied, they'll stay here alone, not only locked in the house, but also needing to pay the remaining amount for the house, and they have no money. Fred laughed. We had only paid half for the house. The next half was due upon departure, and I had left Helen without any money. Moreover, the signal was bad here, and there was no internet, but they would still be found since the lake house owners were supposed to return tomorrow. We were driving and decided to discuss my next steps. I determined that the first order of business would be to consult a lawyer and start the divorce process. Amber offered her help, mentioning that she knew a good specialist who could assist me. Fred added that it was also important to take care of my emotional state and offered several contacts of professional psychologists. I declined the psychologist, but took down the lawyer's contact. Upon returning home in the morning, I immediately prepared the documents attaching a photo taken last night. Since the photo was taken with a flash, everything was clearly visible. I also blocked our joint electronic accounts to prevent Helen from accessing the funds. I changed the locks on the house and installed an alarm system just in case. I also began gathering Helen's belongings and found a pack of condoms we never used and $15,000 in cash in her winter jacket. I was tempted to take the money, but decided to leave it in the jacket and tossed it into her bag, not wanting to take anything from a despicable person. Throughout the day, I gathered all of Helen's things and left them outside the door. The porch was cluttered with her belongings. I didn't care if someone came and stole her things. That was not my problem. What comforted me was that the house was entirely mine, gifted by my parents before my marriage to Helen, so she couldn't claim it. 4 days later, Helen returned to town with Carlos, and they headed straight for my house. I was at work at the time and received a notification that someone was trying to break into my house, with security forces arriving within minutes. I laughed out loud when I went to the police station in the evening and saw the two of them sitting in a cell. At the police station, I confirmed that Helen was my wife, but a court case was pending, and she would soon be my ex. When the security arrived at my house, they saw a man with a bat and a woman trying to break in. They were caught and jailed for a few days, and now Carlos had to buy me a new window. At the police station, I made it clear to him to stay away from me. A month later, the first court session took place. The divorce process was complex and emotionally draining. Helen tried to contact me several times, but I realized that for our mutual good, we needed to give each other space. Meetings with the lawyer and the police took a lot of energy. I got tested for sexually transmitted diseases and fortunately tested negative, unlike Helen, who tested positive, putting Carlos at risk of jail time for engaging in unprotected intimacy, especially since he regularly missed taking his medication, but I didn't care about that. What mattered most was that I was healthy. The hardest part was realizing that life without Helen would be completely different. We had spent so much time together that her absence felt like a missing piece of me, but with each passing day I learned to accept this, focusing on building a new life. Amber and Fred became my pillars during this difficult period. They were always there when times were tough, helping me look forward. Their friendship reminded me that despite all losses, there are still people who love and support me. Gradually, I began to find solace in the little things: evening walks, reading books I had long wanted to read, and even work, which helped me distract myself. I started to rediscover the pleasure of solitude, finding in it not only sadness but also an opportunity for self-development. One day, sitting by the river and watching the sunset, I realized that, despite all the pain and loss, new horizons were unfolding before me. Life after Helen would be different, but that didn't mean it would be worse. I began to feel ready to meet it with an open heart, ready for new challenges and opportunities it would bring. With each new day, I began to feel a bit different. I wouldn't say it was easier. That's not the right term. Rather, I became more focused, finding in myself the strength to look into the future without fear and regret. Amber and Fred continued to support me, and their friendship was the anchor that kept me from sinking into despair. My morning walks became a kind of ritual. I walked along the riverbank, contemplating what I wanted to change in my life. I realized that I wanted to spend more time on myself, my hobbies and interests that had been forgotten. One day, sitting in a cafe and sipping coffee, I felt truly calm for the first time after everything that had happened. I opened a notebook and began to list all the things I had always wanted to do but had postponed. The list was long, from trips I wanted to take to skills I wanted to learn. I suddenly realized that the world around me remained full of opportunities, even if one chapter of my life had been turned. Returning to work was another step forward. I discovered that my passion for cars had not faded. On the contrary, I began to invest even more enthusiasm in it, seeing it not just as a job, but as a way of self-expression. My old Mustang, which seemed to me a reminder of the past, now filled me with a sense of pride and achievement. The most difficult part was learning to trust people again. Meeting new people, interacting with colleagues wasn't always easy, but I gradually learned to open up to the world, understanding that not all stories end like mine with Helen. Helen herself is to blame for getting infected, and now lives in some tiny room in another state, her life not turning out well. She didn't finish college and quit her job. Her affair brought her nothing, and she's to blame for that. The person I once considered a friend is in prison, and it's his fault too. I did nothing wrong to these people. They chose their path, and I just helped them end up where they should be. The main thing is to keep your sanity and believe in the best. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.